investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 76 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So what do we make of demographics and therefore gentrification? And how much of a part should they play when we're searching up a property investment location and making some considerations around what we want to and where we want to invest? Should they be the sole reason or should they form part of a bigger picture? And how can they impact on an existing property investment that you may have already made? Well, I thought we could venture a little bit further into this, but first of all, what is gentrification? Now, the Oxford Languages via Google defines gentrification as the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by wealthier people moving in, improving housing and attracting new businesses, but often displacing current inhabitants in the process. Now, as we do with this podcast, we focus our attention on Melbourne because that's what we know. Now, as with any real city around the world, Melbourne's certainly been gentrifying in different forms and certainly in different locations and at different rates for many decades now. But what does that look like and what should we be looking for that would best benefit investment property selection processes? Firstly, the best thing or one of the most important things I think to keep in mind with gentrification is that it is generally a really slow process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Now, there can be the odd exception to that, and we certainly saw that during the COVID lockdowns, particularly here in Victoria, which prompted a demographic shift in demand for regional properties. But most of the time, it does take decades. And it usually comes in the form of something along the lines of former working class neighbourhoods in inner city areas that or perhaps one-time city fringe locations that are transformed into desirable middle ring suburbs, generally due to urban sprawl and changes in that nature. But what drives this location is what we really want to focus on today, and how does it come about? Well, there's a number of different forms, and I thought I'll just go through a few different things to consider and things that do typically drive the gentrification process and things to be mindful of when looking from an investment property location decision point of view. One of the first ones is underdeveloped or undercapitalised land. So areas where there might be pockets or different forms of land that need to be redeveloped or could be redeveloped. So it could come in the form of infill sites that perhaps haven't been developed over time or perhaps have been sitting there dormant for an extended period of time, so were used for a different purpose along the lines of perhaps the Kodak site up in Coburg. There was the defence housing site out in Maidstone, which is still undeveloped, but certainly a prospect down the track. And look, some of these need to undergo environmental audits based on previous uses, but they could become significant sites. And that can therefore then lead to gentrification because it brings a whole new group of buyers into an area. The other is sites within these areas that perhaps could be rezoned and have what may be considered to be former uses, but are no longer considered to be the highest and best use of that site. So areas like, say, Brunswick is a really good example of that, where there's a lot of light industrial property in that area, which was used for a lot of manufacturing, particularly during the mid-century, 1950s, 60s era. And obviously a lot of the surrounding suburb was occupied by working class people in those areas, and the employment opportunities were driven by that. But a lot of those light industrial uses are no longer, it doesn't benefit to be in Brunswick. From a cost perspective, it may well be that they need to be closer to other roadways, that sort of thing, linkages that can enable the product to be moved a lot easier. And the underlying land value means that they are better suited from a residential purpose. Now, again, providing the environmental audits can be conducted and make the areas residential friendly, we're starting to see a lot of that gentrify in and around that Brunswick area, and a lot of apartment, or even if the old warehouse buildings can be reutilised, they can be converted to warehouse accommodation. So that underdeveloped, undercapitalised land can really start a gentrification process in motion. The other one is properties that are already there being renovated, and what that can do is a lot of buyers don't really have the appetite to carry out works themselves, but they want to be able to see that work is being done or has been done, and that will then attract those types of buyers into those areas because it tends to improve streetscapes, it tends to improve the quality of housing, and it therefore then brings in a variety of buyers as well. What it also can do though is it can start to mean that areas that perhaps are on main roads that have got secondary housing there, they can then start to be developed and bring in mixed-use type developments. And so you might have a retail strip along the ground floor or some form of commercial use, and then have apartment buildings above. And a really good example of that is along Nicholson Street in Abbotsford, whereby one of the great criticisms of Abbotsford has been that it hasn't really had that little village atmosphere. It's relied on Victoria Street, but that hasn't had the local cafe bar lifestyle. It's always had great Vietnamese restaurants, but it hasn't had the cafe culture that Melbourne really yearns for. But what's happened along Nicholson Street is there's been a number of developments occur there where there's now some really good cafes and restaurants along the ground floor with some good quality apartment buildings going in above. And that's really started to gentrify and help to build that type of commercial atmosphere in there, but also the quality of residential building as well, which obviously then leads to improved retail strips, which is another one from a gentrification process. And obviously Melbourne being known for its cafe culture, and it's a big part of what buyers look for, particularly in inner city living. So the quality of shops and restaurants is really important. And if that starts to develop and gentrify, that brings in obviously employment opportunities, but it also brings in more buyers who want that type of service to be nearby. And again, some good examples of that in terms of the gentrification process have been along High Street in Northcote, which was recently voted one of the best, or not one of, the best commercial strip in the world. So in terms of retail strip, High Street Northcote is extremely highly regarded. And that's gentrifying further as you go out High Street into suburbs like Thornbury, Preston, and out to Reservoir as well. And the other one that has been really noticeably improving in the last probably 10 years has been Swan Street in Richmond, which has become a real hub for cafes and bars and restaurants along there. It was always considered for a long time the poor cousin to Bridge Road, Richmond. Whereas Bridge Road now, from a retail perspective, is no longer what it used to be, and Swan Street certainly changed in that regard and become extremely desirable. The next one is probably improved infrastructure, and any ways that can happen can really start to gentrify a suburb as well. So that can happen in the form of public transport, perhaps being extended further out to link outer suburbs into the inner city, which will provide and certainly make a suburb more desirable to those that do need and rely on public transport, which is a lot of people in and around Melbourne. But also other forms of infrastructure in terms of roadways, and we're seeing a lot of that at the moment with the northeast link, but other road linkages around in the western suburbs too, with the Westgate Tunnel, those sorts of things. So the road linkages are really important, but then also things like hospitals, and out in the western suburbs around Footscray, the Western Hospital coming in there, and that's really going to provide plenty of employment opportunities, which will again bring in more people into that Footscray market, which again is continuing to gentrify a lot over recent times. If we then move into another one, which I think is a big one, it's just more a case of this is education facilities. The query here is, and I think a lot of this occurs with gentrification, is it can be a bit of a chicken or egg. So is gentrification being driven by some of these changes, or are these changes driving gentrification? And I think education facilities are a big one in that regard. So where do they sit? And I do tend to think that the quality of education facilities probably respond a little bit more, or probably sit a bit in the middle. So the gentrification process starts, and as a result of that, education facilities can improve, but then what they can continue to do is drive that gentrification process even further. And a good example of that from an education point of view is Northcote High School. So Northcote's obviously been gentrifying a lot for a number of years, and it's a great area with great retail precincts, with really good parkland access, with great public transport, but probably didn't have for a long time the education that people perhaps wanted. But Northcote High School now is one of the key drivers, and the zoning that obviously it has in place can drive values around Northcote as well from a property price perspective, because people are really wanting to focus on getting into the Northcote High School zone like they have done with Uni High or with Baldwin High and other McKinnon Secondary College, a lot of other public secondary schools around Melbourne. Northcote High is doing that too, and I think that's showing part of that gentrification process. And then finally, housing unaffordability in neighbouring suburbs can lead to that bridesmaid suburb effect, which no doubt many of you have heard about and read about over time. And that's obviously looking for affordable alternatives that will still provide many of the benefits of perhaps a neighbouring suburb, but perhaps at a more affordable price, but still offer perhaps similar housing styles, services, and access to some of the facilities in the inner city suburbs as well. So that can certainly start to drive gentrification in an area as well. So I thought now what I'd also do is give you a couple of examples, one of a suburb that obviously has been gentrified for an extended period of time, but one that's started the process and I think has still got a ways to go. First up is obviously is Richmond. Now Richmond, many of you will say, well, that's quite obvious, but it's more to talk about why that's happened and what's led to that. Obviously, it was initially a working class suburb, a lot of miners' cottages built in and around there, the single fronted basic terrace houses. And then continued to boom, but still very much as a working class suburb from migrant population, given the post-war immigration boom that Australia and Melbourne had. That was further enhanced, that workers suburb stigma was further enhanced by the Housing Commission towers being constructed during the 1960s. But then as we moved into the 1990s and that inner city lifestyle and the cosmopolitan lifestyle that Melbourne's become famous for, and the inner city suburbs really started to become quite popular, and the access to the city was really important from an employment point of view. But obviously the retail strips in and around Richmond were highly regarded as well. Bridge Road was considered one of Melbourne's more sought after retail strips, that and Chapel Street. But also things like the proximity to the MCG, as the AFL became more and more popular and attendances and focus more around those single stadiums as opposed to the suburban stadiums. So that really drove Richmond as a popular spot to live. And in more recent times, Cremorne, which is a part of Greater Richmond, has now become known as Silicon Yarra, given that the tech boom that's occurred in the light industrial pocket between Swan Street and the Yarra River. And that's really kicked in and around that area and driven further development in the Richmond location, which has been further enhanced, as I said before, by Swan Street and the continued development of the cafes and the restaurants in and around that area. So I think Richmond as a suburb really exemplifies that gentrification process and really puts that into perspective. One that I think is continuing to develop is in the inner northern suburbs, or probably more middle ring suburbs, is Reservoir. Now, it's still very much gentrifying and is benefiting from the continued development of High Street. As I said before, Northcote is very well regarded, and High Street continues to go with Thornbury and the Welcome to Thornbury trucks and how well that does out there, but also pushing into Preston and then further out into Reservoir. It offers as a suburb some really desirable housing. Many of you will know about the boom of mid-century fashion, both from a retail perspective, but also from a furnishing point of view. And Reservoir as a suburb offers a lot of mid-century 1950s, 60s housing and villa units as well. But it also presents plenty of opportunities for developers to construct modern dwellings, but also townhouse developments. So there's flexibility there to offer a variety of housing types. But it also has fantastic transport links, really good parklands, but also good access to the facilities that Preston offers, so around Northland as well. So you get that bridesmaid effect of being able to utilise the next suburb in's facilities, but also have some great options for that suburb in its own merit. So I think as a suburb, I think Reservoir will continue to gentrify going forward as well. Now, I just guess to summarise what we've spoken about today and what things to take away and to consider is that you've probably noticed from the discussions, and particularly from the two suburbs there that we've just spoken about, is that gentrification hasn't been the sole driver in these areas or in these suburbs. And there's generally been a reason why they have gentrified over these recent times. And that's what I think when you're doing your research and considering where you want to buy, it's something that you need to consider, is that it's not just the gentrification process, it's the underlying thing that's driving it. And that will draw more people in, which will continue to push that gentrification further into the future. What you don't want to do is get caught up in trying to predict where the next gentrification process may occur, because, as we said, it is a slow process. It can take time. And as a result, you may well be better off investing in something that's perhaps already shown good performance, but has got greater potential to go further into the future. That's really the ideal scenario, rather than having something that's already too far gone or getting in too early and having to wait for it to play catch up. So that's about it for today's episode. Again, as always, thanks very much for joining me. Please feel free to share the podcast far and wide so that we can increase our listenership. For further information on how to make rewarding property decisions, please visit our website, wakeland.com.au. Otherwise, we wish you the best with your property decisions.